Welcome everyone, thanks for joining us. I'm Nikki Jovicic from LookUpStrata, and for today's WA webinar session we welcome back Scott Bellerby from B Strata. This WA webinar is all about getting ready for your AGM. We'll investigate the Council's role during and leading up to meetings and how they should prepare for their AGM. What do they need to consider regarding new legislation or potential changes to the existing legislation? Scott will be outlining the correct governance around convening both council meetings and general meetings of the Strata Company, and this will be followed by some discussion and Q&As. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that the information contained in the session, including the discussions that arise from submitted questions, is not legal advice and should not be relied upon as legal advice. You should seek independent advice before acting on the information contained in the session. We thank Scott Bellerby from B Strata for joining us this morning. With 2 decades of property experience, Scott is regarded as WA's leading strata expert. Scott started B Strata in 2014. He became president of SCA WA in 2016, completed a 4-year term and is now immediate past president. Scott worked extensively on the 2020 reforms to the legislation for over 5 years to ensure a balanced and effective review of the Strata Titles Act. He's leading a review of these reforms, hosting monthly Leongate Strata Reform Working Group meetings. Scott's aim is to see the strata industry recognised for its professionalism and expertise. In addition to the above, Scott sits on numerous boards and committees. B Strata are industry leaders in WA. B Strata continues to revolutionise management processes and drive efficiencies in this space. They continuously look to find ways to innovate and evolve. B Strata's mission is to create harmonious, sustainable communities. Scott and the team at B Strata regularly appear in the WA Strata magazine, and they assist our WA readers with answers to tricky strata questions. This is the second webinar Scott has joined us for. Around about a year ago, we recorded a WA Ask Us Anything session, and Scott recorded a video with us to help our audience navigate the Omicron situation in WA back in February this year. Those videos have received hundreds of views, helping hundreds of our readers, and we thank Scott and his team for this assistance. So what I'm going to do now, I'll leave you with Scott to have the discussion with you about the AGMs. I'll jump in and open the chat and I'll be communicating with you in there, and then I'll join back with you again a little bit later to move into the Q&A. So welcome, Scott, for joining us for another webinar today.
Thanks very much for having me again, Nikki. So I guess the format today was really just to go over, I guess, the framework of an AGM and a council meeting, and you know, noting this time of year, it's certainly a very busy time for the strata manager and for the councillors with regards to getting ready for AGMs. You know, typically we do see a bit of a peak, usually around July, August, September, and trailing into October. So I'm sure you've all either just finished an AGM or just about to be commencing one. So I think just to go through, I guess, the formalities of what you should be thinking about. The legislation requires that a strata company hold an AGM every 12 months, and it must be within 15 months of the last AGM. Although saying that generally best practice would be that you would hold the AGM within 15 months of the end of your financial year. I guess the first point to start with is going back and having a look at the minutes of your last AGM. And when was the last AGM? What were some of the motions passed at the AGM? Has the Strata Company given specific direction for the council to perform certain duties over the year, and has the council been able to achieve those directives? When you look to start preparing for the AGM, the key items really come down to how is the Strata Company performing, what are some of the challenges that the Strata Company has faced, and where are you sitting with regards to the maintenance of the scheme. And when you are leading into the AGM, probably the best recommendation would be that the council call a council meeting and the councillors get together and ideally maybe do a walk around the scheme and note any items that might need attention, and then provide direction with regards to what they should then look to include in the notice for the AGM. Yeah, with regards to preparing a notice for the AGM, section 127 is fairly specific with regards to what must be included. There are 3 items in particular that must be conducted at every AGM, and that is an election for the council, consideration of the accounts, and the presentation of the insurance certificates. And really the presentation of the insurance certificates is just to review, are you adequately insured? When was the last time you had a valuation to determine the replacement cost? Is your office bearer's liability sufficient? Is your public liability high enough that the minimum requirement's 10 million, but arguably that should be higher for some schemes. It also probably gives you an opportunity to review fees and commissions that make up that renewal. In the end, there's a lot of work that goes into it, so it should be expected that there are fees that may be incurred with regards to renewal. So just making yourself aware of what they are. And then any other business outside of those 3 items should be treated as special business. When it comes to special business, any owner can make application with regards to an item to be included on the agenda. The council may want to write to the owners and seek any feedback prior to preparing and finalising the notice to be sent out to the owners. And this gives them an opportunity to engage with owners, ensure that they're considered with regards to the running of the scheme, and making sure that there's nothing that they themselves might have overlooked. So when you do look to include or start drafting your agenda, it's important that the basic formalities are included: date, time, location, and then you also need to detail by what means is the owner expected to vote on each of the motions. With the new legislation, there's been the introduction of electronic voting, and if that's available, you need to detail that on the agenda. Also, again, like today, a lot of meetings are now being conducted via Zoom and Teams meetings and other electronic platforms. If that's going to be available, you need to detail that on the notice of the AGM as well, and ensure that the owners are aware of how they can participate outside of the location which the meeting may be conducted. Then there's also a requirement that with regards to sending the notice, that while the legislation says 14 days, and I think it was always the intentions of Landgate that electronic service of notices would be appropriate. A few recent SAC decisions are suggesting that they still want to see 14 clear days be given to all residents, also all owners. And in a recent decision, you have to take into consideration Australia Post and their delivery times. And to that regard, Australia Post generally take 3 to 7 days to deliver. So it would be I would recommend that in sending out your notice for a general meeting, that you consider giving at least 21 days notice, just to avoid any challenges that may come through at a later date if there's anything contentious there. So it is important that you give clear notice, at 14 days clear notice, and that everyone receives a copy of the agenda, although technically that does not invalidate the general meeting. I think probably one of the biggest challenges we face when we look to convene a general meeting is also people being aware that if they're co-proprietors, we need a proxy from a co-proprietor nominating which of the co-proprietors is going to vote on the motions, and the same goes for companies. So again, this is something to be considered, providing proxy forms in the agenda to make it easier for owners to complete. The other thing is it's also very important with regards to council nominations. While individuals can be nominated at the general meeting, there is a requirement that co-proprietors approve who's going to be nominated, and particularly for companies need to confirm their nomination for a general meeting. So having those forms available in the agenda pack is also very helpful. When we move into the special business, typically what you'll find being the first item of special business will be the approval of the minutes of the previous AGM. While there isn't any legislative framework around how the minutes should be approved, typically it would be someone that was present at the previous AGM that would be able to endorse the validity of those minutes and would approve them. Needless to say, there isn't that framework there. So, typically, it's the responsibility sits with the secretary of the Strata Company with regards to the minutes. So it is important that minutes are taken and that they do represent the outcome of the motions, and that's really what needs to be considered when you're looking to approve the minutes. When you start to then move through other items that should be included on the agenda, there is a requirement under section 118 that you look to authorise who can execute documents on behalf of the Strata Company. And those documents can be appointment of the Strata manager, the cleaners, the gardener, any works projects that you may want to commence throughout the year. So it's important that you pass a motion detailing who's authorised to execute those documents. And under section 118, either a member of the council or the Strata manager can be authorised to execute documents. So that is also an important consideration that needs to be included in the agenda. Then the next item is then really that there's a requirement under section 102 that in setting your budget, you need to consider the 10-year maintenance plan. Hopefully by now, all those Strata companies that are required to have a 10-year maintenance plan have approved a 10-year maintenance plan at an AGM. If not, then it's essential that you do approve the 10-year maintenance plan. And when it comes to approving the 10-year maintenance plan, you do need to detail who undertook the 10-year plan, their qualifications, and the date the plan was undertaken, because there is a requirement that every 5 years you do have a new plan prepared. So it is important that you include that date. So those particulars must be included in the motion when it comes to approving the 10-year plan. Now, the 10-year plans, it's a guide, it's not a Bible. It's an indication of maintenance items that have been identified that need to be addressed by the Strata Company over the next 10 years. And then it gives you a a financial guide around what you should be raising around your reserve fund to then be able to address those items. It isn't a requirement that the items in the 10-year plan identified in year 1 must be done in year 2, and those in year 2 must be done in year 2. The Strata Company and the council have the freedom to move those maintenance items around based on their priorities and the way they see it needs to be performed. But there is, I think, something that's being missed, and a lot of these safety plans, so a lot of these 10-year plans are also identifying safety issues, trip hazards, beams that might be rotted and could be in risk of falling down. These actually become safety issues, and with the plan identifying that and the owners accepting the plan, they've then made themselves aware that there is a safety risk, and that does really put them in and it provides a high level of obligation with regards to the owners ensuring that those items are then addressed. There was the new WHS legislation that came into effect this year, and that it has imposed a lot greater penalties with regards to failure to adhere to safety requirements. If you're a strata scheme that employs their caretaker or their gardener, or has a commercial element to it, then you have a lot higher responsibilities under the definition PCBU, a person conducting a business or undertaking, and if you fail in your safety obligations there, you can end up in prison, and the fines are in the millions. So if you have a 10-year maintenance plan that's gone and identified safety concerns, then you need to make them a priority, and you can't ignore them and put them back a year. Even if you're just a residential scheme, there are exemptions, but Section 29 of the WHS does also require that other persons must take reasonable care to ensure that their acts or omissions do not adversely affect others. And so while you might not be defined as the new term PCBU, you do still have obligations under Section 29 of the WHS Act to make sure that, when you're on site, your guests, yourself, your contractors are all safe and aren't subject to any hazards. So this really needs to become a higher focus with regards to the responsibility of strata companies. And it now also requires a bit more awareness around, what would be some of those other safety items that you should consider. Your RCDs need to be tested annually. Again, consideration should be considered with regards to testing there. A backflow test done for your fire system is important for the hose if you don't have fire pumps on site. So these items should arguably now be listed in the agenda and noted that yes, they have been action and maybe a date when they were last attended. The other element probably with regards to the 10-year maintenance plan, which unfortunately was missed by Landgate, and it's something which we're trying to maybe get addressed in the current review of the regulations, which we'll hopefully get through in the next 6 months, is the 10-year plan failed to identify the electrical infrastructure of the scheme. And I think we're all aware of electrical vehicle charges and solar and all these other sustainable elements. In the end, it all comes back to the suitability of the electrical infrastructure of the scheme. The 10-year plan should be considering that, but unfortunately, probably the qualifications of a lot of people undertaking those 10-year plans is not adequate. And so, in going through preparation for your agenda, you should start to think about getting an assessment done on the electrical infrastructure. Make sure you get an electrical compliance certificate, because a lot of the guys that might be doing solar and EVs, they may not necessarily be licensed. Regardless if they are licensed, there's now higher obligations on the electrician that if they come in and find that your electrical infrastructure isn't compliant, they have a positive obligation to report you to Western Power and arguably turn off your power. So I think you're better forewarned by being proactive in that space and getting your electrical infrastructure looked at, rather than suddenly finding the lights have been turned off and you're scrambling to try and find someone to come out and fix your, or bring your main switchboard up to compliance standards. So that's also critical. There are a range of other elements that you could consider. An asbestos report could also be progressed. While it isn't a legislative requirement that a residential scheme has an asbestos report, it is a requirement, as I've highlighted, that you have to ensure that your site is free from hazards. So I would still argue that under Section 29, you should potentially be looking to get an asbestos report prepared for the scheme. You need to make the contractors aware that are attending site if there are any hazards. They've got families and they want to get home to their families and live long lives as well. And you can't take for granted that they're going to be aware if there's asbestos on site. As owners, you need to be proactive and become aware of what those hazards are, and arguably getting a safety report done and really drilling down into where those hazards may lie is prudent. And then also consideration, if you're a multi-tier scheme, I do suggest that you need to start thinking about getting a fire evacuation plan prepared, because again, it comes down to mitigating those risks. So there are a few of the items that you should really start to consider at the front end of the agenda under special business, because that then leads into your budget and approving the budget. And before you can approve the budget, you really need to understand, well, what are going to be your expenditure requirements? So these are the things which the council should consider when they're sitting down at their council meeting a few months before they're wanting to conduct the AGM and preparing the agenda. And once you start to move through the budget, most of what I've spoken about tend to be maintenance items. But if there's any items there that you're looking to improve the common property, you're wanting to put the pool into the front courtyard of the scheme, that's an improvement to common property. That actually requires a special resolution, and there is a requirement that you provide quotes for that for the owners to give consideration to. If it's just normal maintenance requirements of the scheme and general upkeep of the scheme, it is just an ordinary resolution, and the budget can be amended at the AGM. Once you've approved your budget, you then look to approve your levy schedules, and this is also important. You need to detail when levies will be raised and when they will fall due and payable, and what the unit entitlement allocation for the levies is as well. So they're the high-end formalities with regards to preparing an agenda. Other considerations may be, do you have a debt recovery bylaw, and what would be the procedure you may enact when it comes to doing debt recovery? You could include that, and those motions, ideally will be drafted in the notice, and then they're approved, and then there's an obligation that the new council needs to perform those duties that the council has approved at the AGM. A lot of the time you might see councillors wanting to come on because they have their own agenda, which is fine. They might have that, but the first item, the most important thing is they need to deal with the agenda that's been approved at the AGM first, before they give consideration for other items that they might want to see. If the owners have voted on something and that's been approved by way of a motion at a general meeting, the council is obligated to perform that duty. So there, I guess, the specifics with regards to the AGM. I know that there are a few questions out there, and I've been seeing the screen light up quite a few times there with additional questions. What I might do is pass back to Nikki and give her an opportunity to go through some of the questions that have been posed.
Thanks so much, Scott. We can certainly do that. Yeah, we've had quite a few questions come in while you were speaking, which is really good to see. Please feel free to keep on adding those in, and we'll get to as many as we possibly can today. I guess while you were speaking, one of the things that came to mind for me, Scott, was I was listening to, I think it was Amanda Farmer's podcast from a few weeks back, and she was speaking to a strata manager, and that strata manager was saying how much easier their job is if they go along to the meeting and the lot owners have actually read the paperwork that's been sent out to them prior. So yeah, that was one of the things. I thought maybe you'd like to comment on that. I'm sure we've got some lot owners in here and some council members that feel the same way as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Like in the end, the AGM is about setting an agenda for the management of your property, which is arguably your most valuable asset, and it only happens once a year. So as an owner, when you're looking to turn up to the AGM, you should probably take a copy of what the agenda is along with you. It's definitely prudent that you read the agenda before you get there. In the end, we like to have efficient and productive AGMs, and we don't like to have AGMs that drag on for 3 or 4 hours, mainly because owners haven't read the agenda before attending. We would love it if owners read the agenda and got their questions in, 3 or 4 days before the meeting, so that we're prepared and maybe could even answer the questions prior to the AGM, so we don't have to take up that added time. I've recently had an AGM that went on for 4 hours. It did take us an hour to appoint a chairperson. It wasn't a team that I manage, but in the end, owners, it's once a year. Like, just to take 10 minutes prior to the meeting, ideally a couple of days before the meeting, and go through the agenda, it can save everyone a lot of time.
I think she was saying she's she just hears that shuffle of paper during the meeting, and that's that's the thing she'd rather not.
And just having your proxy forms. The number of times I've had co-proprietors turn up and say, "Oh, my wife's here, I don't need to fill in a proxy form." Or my husband's here, I don't need to fill in the proxy form. I said, well, yes, no, technically, yes, you do. And I would still ask that the both of you fill this in, and can you please let me know who's going to be raising their hand to vote on the motions? I just don't know how many times every year the same people have the same argument with us. It'd be great if they could just maybe fill in that proxy form and just, tick and during, so they don't have to worry about it next year.
Definitely. Okay, that's great. Thank you. All right, we had a few questions come in via email, so we might just head over to those first. So one of them was from Andrew. How can we ensure all points and discussion topics are completely and correctly minuted? Over the years, minutes published by the strata manager who chairs the meeting after the AGM have missed key points. Obviously, there's a lot to write down. Can they perhaps record the meeting and transcribe it later?
I don't prescribe to the idea that the strata manager needs to minute verbatim. It's not relevant. In the end, the only relevant point was what was the motion? Have you detailed the motion? I.e., it was resolved that the Strata Company direct the council to appoint John Doe to fix the brick wall at a cost not to exceed $5,000. Now, did that pass? Yes, it did. That's all that needs to be recorded. We don't have to talk about all the other contractors that were considered or anything else. It really just comes down to the specifics of the motion. And did it pass? And yes or no? And we don't need to talk about or minute anything else. You know, if there's anything critical that could lead to a litigious matter, you may make a few extra notes around it. But no, recording what everyone said at a meeting is not what we're out to do. That's not the purpose of the AGM. All we're looking for is a motion that directs the council on what they need to do.
We have had lots of questions over the years about the amount of detail that should be provided in those minutes. So, and I think generally any state, any response that we've gotten has been very similar to the response that you've just given then. So good to hear. Okay, Kim was asking for our 19 lot survey strata council of owners. The strata manager has advised that items of general business under section 129 of the Act do not apply to our AGM, and they will not enforce any requirements to provide a notice of items for the agenda. We're not provided with actual minutes of meetings, but only receive a description of issues from the chairman. When we have works done, we don't know any details in the contract, such as the scope of works. Various rules have been made by the chairman, but they're not distributed to owners, and we only become aware when we break the rules. We're very unhappy and reluctant to spend money getting clarification from the tribunal. So there's obviously quite a bit going on here in this scheme.
Yeah, there's a fair bit to read into there. Yeah, in the end, without an approved budget and without motions giving instruction on what's to be done, a council can't just run off and do whatever they like. There needs, the purpose of the legislation is that there's a framework provided around how the Strata Company and as a result the council is to perform, and that really comes down to you need to have minutes detailing what was the approved budget and what is the levy schedules. And it's also essential to note that when it comes to selling the lot, under section 156, you have to provide a copy of the minutes. Now, the chairperson is, there's a requirement that the council is made up of a minimum of 3 and a maximum of 7 generally. The bylaws may change that, but for most schemes it's between 3 and 7. If you don't have 3 owners willing to put their hand up, then all the owners are members of the council, and every decision has to be put to all owners. But if you do have a council, and we can assume, let's assume it's 3, the chairperson doesn't have any more authority than anyone else on the council. The role of the chairperson is to help guide the meetings of the council and the Strata Company. Ultimately, I'd say most of the authority sits with the secretary, because the secretary has the authority to call meetings and deals with communication. The treasurer oversees the expenditure. So the chairperson doesn't have any added authority. So a chairperson running around doing whatever they think fit, they want to be able to do it, is taking a huge risk there, because he's doing it without any authority, and arguably the owners could seek or could take him to court with regards to some of the duties or some of the actions he may be performing. So there is a requirement the owners need to stand up for themselves at the AGM and appoint a council that they want. And then it's a responsibility of the councillors to make sure that they're performing duties that meet all the requirements of the Strata Company. So it is important that there are minutes taken, and the Strata, if they're having a Strata manager appointed, I'm sure it's probably a contracted duty. So the Strata manager is failing in their duty to provide minutes, assuming they're invited to the meeting, and it does sit in their contract.
Okay, and probably on from that, we just got asked in chat a few minutes ago from CE, which authority will receive complaints on the misconduct of an AGM?
So what was that one? So
That's okay. Which authority will receive complaints on the misconduct of an AGM?
Well, SAT deals with all strata matters. So, yeah, and in the end, owners, can take any, or owners, tenants, any interested party can take any matter to SAT with regards to the Strata Company. It isn't, it costs a couple of $100. I can't remember. I think they've recently put their fees up. It's less than $200. And if you can't get satisfaction from the council or assistance from your strata manager, then that's what SAT's there for. The opportunity to go and have your grievance heard at SAT is what what you can do.
And you spoke there about the roles of the different members on the council. So would you just like to cover the role of the strata manager as well, Scott, while we're there?
Well, in the end, the strata manager is just a contractor. They've been contracted by the Strata Company to assist in performing certain duties, just like the cleaner, the lift contractor, the fire maintenance contractor. So really, the strata manager's role is really determined by what are their contracted duties and what sits in their management contract, and what authority the Strata Company or the council may pass on to the strata manager. So it shouldn't be assumed that the strata manager is the responsible party. You could basically have a contract that all you do is receipt monies and do the accounts administration. It really comes down to what is sitting in the agreed services for the strata manager, and then has the strata company authorise the strata manager to perform those tasks. And that might come down to the section 118. Is the strata manager authorised to execute contracts? Can they help appoint the gardener or the fire contractor or the lift contractor? So it comes back to that section 118 authority as well. There's a lot of duties which the strata manager can assist with. Section 143.5 outlines what they're not allowed to do. But apart from those items listed under section 143.5, the strata manager can perform all the duties of the strata company.
And we've just had, oh, sorry, go on.
Yeah, and a lot of the time, the strata manager does perform all those duties. Sorry.
I think it's really great to get that clarification, because I think there is some confusion out there. We've just received a comment from Carol saying, once I realised that as a lot owner, I was part of the Strata Company and decision-making came from the Strata Company, not the Strata Manager. This was a big wake-up call for me after years of ownership. Never used to go to the AGMs, and now I do and take a more active role nominating for COO. So,
yeah.
All right, that's great. Yeah, good. That's excellent news too, Carol. Good for you. Okay, we had a question come in from Glenda, and that was if a poll vote is called for by an owner for motions and for the election of the Strata Council, can the chairman request a show of hands first to see if a poll vote is necessary? And can a written request for a poll vote be added to an AGM motion from an absentee owner, or does an owner have to be present at the meeting to call the poll vote?
So a poll vote is a vote counted by unit entitlement. It's a term which I guess we use frequently within the industry, but it's not referenced in the legislation. So a vote by unit entitlement can be called by anyone prior to the motion being voted on, and that can be in writing before the AGM commences. So, if an owner would like all the motions determined by a poll vote, they can write in and do so. That is an option. And the chair, you can't have a a show of hands prior to moving to a poll vote. If a proxy or an owner elects that the motion is to be determined by unit entitlement, then that motion must be determined by unit entitlement, and the strata manager should record the way the lots vote. And so that requires an extra administrative duty when it comes to the minute taking.
And are you able to give an example of where it might be beneficial for a poll vote to be taken? Why would someone request a poll vote?
Sometimes you might find that there are one or two lots. A poll vote is a strategic vote that it helps recognise that if you have a high unit entitlement, you have a high liability to the scheme when it comes to your levy requirements. So people may call a poll vote around levies and budgets, because they may see that they're contributing more, and therefore they should have a higher value weighting with regards to their vote. It might be strategic when it comes to council appointments. It's a shame. In the end, a poll vote's there, and any owners or proxies entitled to use it. But it's generally preferred that maybe it's just a show of hands and it's a general consensus, majority consensus. But it's there's a lot of reasons why you might see a vote by unit entitlement called, and usually a strategic decision.
Okay, thank you. And we also had a question from Ed saying, is the Council of Owners required to distribute meeting minutes after the meeting? And if so, how many days do they have to distribute the minutes?
The council isn't obligated to distribute their minutes. Certainly they're obligated to take minutes of their council meeting. I'm assuming that this is in relation to a council meeting. In the end, the council can discuss a lot of matters, and there isn't any obligation that they release their minutes. In the end, those minutes are always available if an owner wants to come in and search the books and records. But there isn't a positive obligation for the council to release their minutes. A lot of schemes do, but that they don't. The council isn't obligated to do it.
Okay, and then we also had one from Steve to say, how do you prepare an agenda? Is there a set format we should be sticking to each meeting? Can that format be can that format of the meeting be less formal, or should we stick to a strict routine and make it fairly uniform across all meetings?
A lot of strata companies, sort of by way of the strata manager, may enact standing orders with regards to how a meeting may be conducted. It generally might be taken that in the chair reading a motion, it's moved, and therefore the motion is able to be put to the meeting. I would suggest that for 90% of the meetings we hold here at B Strata, it's a fairly informal process, and we will not enact the standing orders. In the end, if you do want to bring in the standing orders, that there's always that option. And if you bring in standing orders, it's really the chair, so that the chair has the authority on how he would like the meeting to be conducted, and therefore that the chair may enact standing orders. And typically, what you will find is that you need a seconder for every motion to be put to the floor. When the motion is seconded, it's assumed that it's moved by the chair by reading the motion and then needs to be seconded. It's then up for debate. You then talk about the motion. If people would like to amend the motion, you need a mover and a seconder for the amendment, and then the motion may be amended. And then you'll come back to the substantive motion and then vote on that again. But it's generally taken that if you've approved the amendments and the amendments have passed, the chair may just say, well, I therefore will take that the substantive motion's been passed and the motion is now passed. So that's sort of one option of the standing orders that you may see. In the end, the legislation doesn't require that. It is basically you put the the Strata Company resolve to do whatever it is, and either it's by vote by unit entitlement or it's by show of hands, and that's generally how you'll find most meetings conducted.
Okay, and then just to let everybody know, Scott and I had a quick discussion just before we started the session about the benefits of possibly having a fairly straightforward agenda format put forward, and Scott's agreed to pull something together for us and make it available. So it might not be today because I just asked him short notice, but
give me a week, I'll get you something in a week.
That's it, yeah. So we'll get it out to you.
We have a fairly detailed agenda that considers probably a lot of the points I raised earlier, but for most schemes, you just in the end, I'll prepare an agenda that's very simple in its format.
Okay, so hopefully that will be of use to everyone, and we'll get that out to you in about a week or so's time. So keep an eye out for that in your inbox. We'll send it through via email. Okay, that's great. Thanks, Scott. And then we had some questions come in, obviously, while we were chatting as well. So one of them was from Dee saying, can the Strata manager with COO approval insist the meeting is held on Zoom or Teams, etc.? We have resistance from owners who are not tech savvy and insist they want to come into the office.
Yeah. In the end, I think 12 months ago with COVID, I think it was accepted that everything was going to be done via electronic communication, and owners weren't insisting that they come in. They're understanding of that. The legislation probably it does dictate how the meeting is to be conducted. It would be a shame if assuming that circumstances permitted, you didn't have an option for a face-to-face AGM. I can understand EGMs, motions passed outside of a general meeting. They're all forming part of a regular routine now for strata managers. But in the end, you probably you can dictate that the location is electronic if that's what you wanted to do. But I would be reluctant to suggest that. And I would sort of suggest that you should always try and have an AGM location where people can come in and do a face-to-face if they are limited by their ability to use electronic format. But and the other side of the coin is you don't have to provide electronic means either. If you've got a big scheme and you're wanting to have it in the local community centre, there isn't that positive obligation either to provide electronic format, but you should detail that in the notice when it's sent out.
Okay, thank you. And we had a question from Rick asking, can the council hold a meeting immediately after the AGM and delegate office bearer positions? Are they able to waive the required 7 days notice if they are all present?
If all councillors agree, you don't have to wait the 7 days. So if all councillors are in agreement, you can hold a meeting immediately. But if there's been nominations for council and they weren't present, then you're limited in that ability to waive the 7 day requirement.
Okay, hopefully that helps, Rick. And then Marianne asked, would you note on the agenda the date that the plan was conducted or the date the plan comes into play?
The plan was that the date the scheme was formed? I'm sorry, where's that question?
That's what I was thinking. It was fairly high up. Or if you're still in here, Marianne, if you can give us some 10-year plan. The 10-year.
So the 10-year, there is a requirement that you have the date the 10-year plan was prepared, because that will give you the reference on when you need to come back and review the plan. So there is that legislative obligation that it's reviewed every 5 years. That's why when the Strata Company approves the plan, You have to detail the author, their qualifications, and the date the plan was undertaken as a reference point for when you then have to come back and get it done again.
Okay, and we were asked the question as well, it's the next one on there from David, saying what qualifications should the person preparing the 10-year plan have? Our building is $80 million and the 10-year plan has been prepared by a non-qualified person.
Yeah, it is one of the failings of the legislation that it didn't stipulate what the qualifications needed to be. It does stipulate that you have to reference what their qualifications are, but that could just be an electrician, whatever qualification they may hold, accountant. I would certainly recommend that you need to that you get someone, at least ideally a quantity surveyor, someone with a building license that understands buildings. For our big schemes, we tend to seek an engineer qualification, and for our really big schemes, there might be both a QS and an engineer. But then you're talking of arguably, we've got 10-year plans that will cost us more than $20,000 to have prepared. But when you've got a scheme that might be worth $100 to $200 million, that there's a fair bit involved there, and you really want to be across everything that needs to be maintained and what you need to be budgeting for, because there can be some very expensive plant there, and and if you're not aware of it, it could really cost you a lot more in the longer term.
Okay, and then Santa's just asked, and we have been asked this quite a few times from COO members, can I do my own plan? So she's asking, can a COO member draft a 10-year maintenance plan? And maybe if you can mention, Scott, whether you think that's a good idea and why it might not be a good idea.
Yeah, like in the end, yes, a member of the council can prepare their 10-year plan, but I then come back down to work health and safety obligations and section 29, and you have a duty of care there to make sure that the site is safe. If you're overlooking some of those elements and just preparing your own plan, then I think you need to be very careful. And also there are a lot of elements, even in a simple 6-lot villa complex. How's the guttering? Are the roof beams sufficient? Are there firewalls between the villas if they've got party walls? There's a lot of elements that need to be considered, and I would suggest 99% of our councillors are probably not qualified to really prepare a report, and you really by putting your name to the report, you're taking on some of that litigious responsibility.
Okay, and you just mentioned that about WHS, and I meant to say before that you have written quite a detailed article on that topic that we've published before, so we might share that as well when we send the recording out later, and people can have a look at that as well.
No problem.
Okay.
Yeah, in the end, I believe that there's probably elements in the WHS that's been missed by the drafters. I think while there are exemptions provided for residential schemes, those exemptions were intended for those small single tier 2 to 10 lot villas, which is the majority of what strata lots are, but didn't consider the fact that some of our bigger schemes, we're talking about 250 residential lots with full-time contractors coming and going, maintaining the scheme. I don't think that those exemptions would really apply. So and then when you then move to the requirements under a PCBU, the obligations there are really high, and you don't want to end up in prison because you haven't been adequately performing your duties as a councillor.
Definitely. Okay, that's true. Well, we'll get that out to everyone and they can have a read of that as well on top of the recording, which I think would be good. And we were asked by David, what is exactly meant by ratification of proxies prior to the meeting?
In the end, this is also probably the biggest bane of any strata manager. It's actually having an accurate strata roll of owners. The obligation is on the lot owner to provide the details of the lot ownership, and that should really be reflective, or it needs to be reflective of what's recorded on the certificate of title with regards to the lot. In the end, the strata manager is therefore reliant that that information that's been provided via the Section 105 forms, which is another form which you should probably consider sending out just before you look to send your agenda, is send out a Section 105 form, which is an update of details. Send it out to all the owners. Just make sure you've got everyone's address right, you've got their details right before you send out the agenda, so that you're aware that they are going to get an agenda. But in the end, in ratifying the proxies, it's really coming back down to if the information that's been filled in on the proxy form matches the strata roll. In the end, if it's really going to be a contentious meeting, the strata manager may seek clarification from the council, but they may charge an additional fee and then actually do a check on the lot particulars through Landgate. And that's a cost. It's not an obligation of the Strata Company. It's not an obligation of the strata manager. It's a responsibility of the owner. But sometimes for those really contentious meetings, you may want to make sure that you've got your strata roll correct, and therefore you've got the particulars recorded correctly. And so therefore, when it comes down to the proxy, if the proxy is lot 8, Mr. and Mrs. John and Deidre Smith, and yet the lot is actually the details, a lot of the superannuation fund of the Smiths, it's therefore an invalid proxy.
Okay.
So it's the ratification of the proxies is just making sure that the proxies that have been provided match the strata roll.
And is that also the point where they look at whether the lot owner is financial or not?
Well, that's an obligation which happens at the same time. A strata, a lot is required to have paid the levies and the interest in regards to those levies that may be overdue, and is also subject to the bylaws. The bylaws may also stipulate utilities and a whole range of other items which also may make the lot unfinancial. But the legislation is very specific in that if you have a levy overdue or any interest in relation to that levy that's overdue, it needs to be paid prior to the commencement of the AGM to be eligible to vote. Okay, well, I think we've sort of drilled all these questions into you, Scott, over that last hour. We've come up to the hour now. It's always fun and games with a lot of these questions that come through.
That's it, but that was wonderful. Thank you again, and hopefully we'll have you on in the near future on another topic to inform our audience.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks for joining us for this educational session. If you gained value from the information, please like this video. You can also engage further with LookUpStrata by subscribing to our YouTube channel or by being kept informed about Strata news via our regular newsletters. Our subscribe link is listed in the description box below.